It's officially Sapphic September. At least that's what a few random Instagram posts that I've seen recommending books for Sapphic September have told me, and I am running with it because I love the idea. I love Sapphic literature in all its forms. In fact, and I do have to say this before I get into the rest of the recommendations, I've even written my own Sapphic literature. My most recent novel, The Lady of the Lake, is a Sapphic reimagining of the Arthurian legends set in a medieval fantasy world. And for non-fiction, I've also written All the Violet Tiaras, Queering the Greek Myths, which is a tiny little non-fiction book all about why the queer community, my community, love Greek myth retellings and the power of a queer Greek myth retelling, including the Sapphic. But as All the Violet Tiaras probably suggests to you, I also love reading Sapphic literature. I love it, I love it, I love it so much. And I thought this would be a fun opportunity to basically just do a video where I recommend to you all of my favourite Sapphic books regardless of genre. So whether you're into horror, whether you're into fantasy, science fiction, comic books, lit fic, what have you, then there's hopefully a book in this video for you that you can go and read and check out afterwards. But of course, if I don't mention one of your favourites in this upcoming list, do let me know what it is down below. And in the meantime, let's get into the recommendations. Let's kick things off with some fantasy, shall we? So the first book I want to talk to you about is Fire, Heart, Tiger by Ali de Bodard. Now I want to start with this book in particular because I'm actually just a huge fan of the author's work and I highly recommend checking out all of it. I've read quite a few of her novellas at this point, absolutely adore them, and she writes a lot of Sapphic stories, including another favourite of mine, which is The Vanisher's Palace. But for now I want to focus on Fire, Heart, Tiger, which is, like I said, a novella, so this is a nice little short one. You could probably read this in a day or two, but it packs a punch for being so short. It's about a princess who, when she was younger, was sent away to live in another queendom or kingdom or empire in order to like create a bond between their two civilizations. But her homeland is definitely less powerful in terms of the hierarchy, and something that actually Ali de Bodard often explores in her novels is colonialization as well, and that's a theme throughout this book. And it's now been years since she left that kingdom that she lived in as a child, where she found her first love with another woman and was then sent back home after a devastating fire. And she is trying to prove to her mother that she would be a good leader. They have a bit of a tense relationship, whilst also trying to hide from everyone that there is some sort of magical power within her that she doesn't understand and can't explain. But everything comes to a head when her past love, her lover, the princess of another queendom, arrives at her palace. And I'll say no more than that, but it's really beautiful and it has a lot of twists and turns that you don't expect. It explores toxic relationships both with your family and in romantic relationships, and also about like coming into yourself and embracing who you are, and it's beautiful. I'm also just realising something as I look down at my list on my laptop. 3 out of 4 of the fantasy books on this list have the word fire in their title. I don't know what that means. Maybe Sapphic literature is just fiery, but the next one is Fires of the Faithful. This is the first book in a duology, which very much for me harkens back to very traditional, like high stakes, intricate political world building fantasy of like the 80s and 90s. So if that's the kind of fantasy you love and you haven't read this series, it is an absolute must read. It's again about a young woman who has been raised in a conservatory, so she has been raised to play music. She is an incredible musician, and in the first book she's introduced to another young woman who joins them at their school that she hasn't met before, and they start developing a friendship which might then turn into something more. It's definitely a slow burn, and I would certainly consider the romantic relationship between them like a secondary plot, but an important secondary plot to the overall story, because what is actually happening is the kind of like tension between the two religions in this world coming to a head and leading to a revolt from the old religion who have been oppressed by the new religion. And it is so incredibly well done. Like, the world building is impeccable, and I really enjoy world building that explores kind of the dynamics between religions. I think that's a really interesting way to build your world, so I really love this story. Then lastly, for fiery titles, we have Girls of Paper and Fire, which is the first in a young adult trilogy, but don't think because it's young adult it's going to be any less dark. This is actually an incredibly like impactful, dark, gritty series which explores trauma and sexual violence and empire and patriarchy, and it's about another young woman. I think that's going to be the beginning of a lot of these book descriptions, who is taken from her home early on in the book to become one of the emperor's concubines. This is entirely against her will, and I forget if it's every year or like every few years the emperor will like sort of pick a new batch of concubines. And it starts off in the first book as quite like an insulated series in terms of like the storyline. We are trapped in the palace with her as she navigates this new role and her relationship with the other concubines, and also processing and coping with what is happening to her, and it then expands out as the series grows, and again, like, things come to a head as the empire is challenged, and it is really, really emotional. But the relationship between the two young women who are concubines but who find love with one another is one of the most beautiful sapphic relationships in a fantasy book, in my opinion. Then lastly, for fantasy, we have A Master of Jinn, which is the first novel in kind of a series. I don't know at this point if there's going to be more novels in the series, but there are 3 novellas prior to this novel, if not short stories. Some of them are super duper short, but you can jump in with the novel itself. It's written to work by itself, but the novellas certainly give you some like fun background to the characters. And this follows a police officer in early 1900s Cairo in an alternative version of our past. So this is an alternative fantastical history, which is P. Shelley Clark's speciality, shall we say, and I love what he does with his alternative histories, where jinn are a like active part of society and magic is very, very, very much real and acknowledged. And because of that, we have a police department which specialises in magic and jinn, and we follow our detective who works for this department in the novel as she ends up uncovering like a grander plot and conspiracy within the magical world, and it is just beautifully done. I also love how it incorporates ancient Egyptian mythology into a 20th century setting. Alright, so my next category is kind of like stemming off of fantasy, and it's definitely not fantasy. I don't know what I just said, but it is fairy tale retellings and fairy tale short story collections. So the first book is very much still a fantasy book, and that is The Raven and the Reindeer by T. Kingfisher. Now, like many of you, I love T. Kingfisher, but I often think we forget about some of her back catalogue, and there's some phenomenal books within that, including The Raven and the Reindeer, which is a sapphic retelling of the Snow Queen. Yes, the same Snow Queen written by Hans Christian Andersen, and the same Snow Queen that actually inspired the film Frozen. I love that T. Kingfisher decided to retell a fairy tale I very rarely see retold outside of the Disney adaptation, and make it sapphic. I love a sapphic retelling. Like, I'm not gonna lie to you, if you give me a fairy tale, a myth, a legend, a folktale, what have you, retold in a sapphic version, I'm gonna read it. And this is just a really fun version of that in T. Kingfisher's like quintessential, slightly humorous, clever, fantastical writing. So yeah, if you're a T. Kingfisher fan and you've missed out on some of her back catalogue, including her fairy tale retellings, she also has one of Beauty and the Beast that I absolutely love, then check this out. Then we have 2 collections of short stories which retell fairy tales and have a sapphic twist. The first of those is A Portable Shelter by Kirsty Logan. Now, what is really fun and makes this collection quite unique is the framing structure. So it's actually about a couple, 2 women who are expecting a child. One of them is pregnant, and they've made a promise to one another that they will only tell their child truths. So they won't tell them made up fictional stories, they will only tell them truth. Yet whenever the other one is either away or asleep, in the case of the pregnant one, both women will tell the child different versions of classic Scottish folktales or stories inspired by classic Scottish folktales through Kirsty Logan's beautiful prose. And there's obviously this kind of like underlying sense of like, is that still in keeping with the theme of truths, because do folktales contain a grain of truth? And there's obviously a lot of queering going on within those retellings. This is one of my favourite collections of short stories. I love the structure of it. I think it really adds a sense of like emotion to the overall reading experience, and I also just think Kirsty Logan has really beautiful prose. But in a similar vein, I also have to recommend Kissing the Witch by Emma Donoghue. This is a collection of classic fairy tale retellings. You know, you've got like Snow White in there, you've got, I forget now off the top of my head, but like a lot of fairy tales you will recognise, which also have a framing structure. So what happens in this collection of fairy tale retellings is at the end of each fairy tale, a minor character from that fairy tale will kind of take you into the next story and become a character in the next story. So they're linked in that way, but they're also just really enjoyable as individual stories which centre the women of these original tales. These women become their own heroes, or they save other women, or they're saved by women, and within that you find a lot of sapphic relationships as well. So you might find that in fact Snow White falls in love with the evil queen. Who knows? I won't give it away. Now for sci-fi, I definitely have fewer recommendations. I don't read as much sci-fi, even though I love it, so if you have any sapphic or just generally queer sci-fi book recommendations, let me know because I'd love to read them, but I do have two. The first of those is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I stumbled over that title so many times, let me tell you. Which for me is best summarised as Firefly if it were a book and more queer. It just has that kind of like sort of hope punk sci-fi vibe I love in the TV show Firefly, but in a book, and it's about the crew of a spaceship who are like transporting goods through space. I forget, to be honest, what they're transporting. It doesn't really matter. It's about the characters and they're travelling through space, and it, in some ways it's kind of mundane. It's not got like a big overarching like baddie or like fight against evil or save the universe. It's set in this really interesting creative version of our future, which I would describe as hope punk, because it's not like dystopian. It has a sense of like, oh, we could be something better, and it's about each of these individual characters and their stories now, where they came from, sharing those stories with one another and finding community and family. It is a found family narrative, and within that there are of course sapphic relationships, and it's just beautiful. Like, it's stunning. I would love to see it adapted for the screen, and it's the first in a what do you call a series that's made up of 4 books? It's the first in a series of 4 books which follow different characters in the same universe, and it's just stunning. Then we have This Is How You Lose the Time War. So you know I love this novel because Chris and I literally had a passage of it as a reading during our wedding ceremony. This book is the most beautiful, like, musing on love I have ever read. This is philosophy in fiction. It is stunning. It captures everything I would ever want to say, really, I think, on that subject, and it's told from the perspective of 2 beings. I forget if they're like cyborgs or robots or aliens or what have you, but you know, they're like semi-human, semi-robot beings who travel back and forth in time as part of this time war. So they're from the far-flung future, but they go back into the past in order to fight via like interrupting historical events and leaving traps for the other side, etc, etc, but they're both on opposite sides, and they're leaving each other letters, and that's what you're reading, and the letters are actually written by 2 different authors, which I think works so well, and I don't know how they managed to create something so beautiful together. It's out of this world, but slowly over time they fall in love through these letters unexpectedly, and it's beautiful. Then we come to one of my favourite sapphic subgenres, and that is sapphic horror. I love horror, but sapphic horror is just something else. Like, it is my favourite horror subgenre, and it can sort of take any form. It can be like sci-fi horror, it can be folk horror, it can be ghost horror, slasher horror, but if it's sapphic, I will read it. So one of my top tier favourites, like favourite horror books of all time, is The House of Hunger. This is another book which feels like it's set in a like kind of alternative history, faux historical setting. Like, it seems like our world during the Industrial Revolution, but it's not exactly our world. It's definitely its own world, just inspired by that. And we have 2 kind of classes. We have 2 parts of the world. We have the wealthy who live in one area, and we have the impoverished who live in the other area, and they're the ones, you know, in charge of like making things and doing things, and then the wealthy just live in their big castles like feeding off society. And there's a massive metaphor in there for capitalism and wealth and class going on at its heart, because this is also a novel not about vampires but about bloodsuckers. So our protagonist ends up getting a job as a blood maiden, which is one of the few ways that somebody from her background can leave this impoverished part of the world to go to the rich part of the world to serve in one of these houses to one of these lords or ladies as a blood maiden, which involves basically letting them drink their blood because of its health benefits. But when she gets there, obviously it's not the promotion in society that she quite hoped it would be. It's a lot darker, a lot more mysterious. There's something incredibly nefarious going on at the heart of this house, and she and her fellow blood maidens are both like pitted against one another and also have to come together to figure out what's happening and hopefully, you know, survive. If that sounds maybe a little bit too dark for you though, and you maybe just like your more traditional slasher horror, or you're just sort of easing yourself into the horror genre, then let me recommend to you You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight, which is a young adult horror novel. And I have to say, although I think YA horror can actually be incredibly like brutal, it's a great place to go if you're not ready or prepared for adult horror and want something a little bit lighter. I think that like is like a general rule for me. There's even middle grade horror if you want to start earlier, because it's all fantastic. But in this novel we are at a like summer camp, which is like an experience camp. People go there just for one night and it's a horror experience. So it's basically like you get to live out a reenactment of something like Friday the 13th, a horror camp slasher film, but it's all fake, it's all staged. It's about the adrenaline and the fun and the seeing who wins and survives the night. But of course we meet our characters, who are the crew members at this camp, on a night where things get a little bit too real. Like they're a little bit too real and it's a ton of fun. It would also make a fantastic film. But then lastly for horror, we have a book I would call sort of literary horror, even verging on like dark comedy, and it's definitely not like super duper scary, but it is mysterious and intriguing and a little bit horrifying, and that's Patricia Wants to Cuddle. So this is actually about the cast members of a reality TV show, a bit like The Bachelor. I think I've never seen The Bachelor, but I think it's like The Bachelor in the sense that we have a bunch of women competing for one man, and our protagonist has made it to like the final four, I think it is, a final group of people, but she actually is coming to the realisation that she doesn't fancy him. In fact, she doesn't even think she fancies men. She just fancies women. She doesn't really want to end up with this guy. She actually has a crush on one of her fellow co-stars. So she's kind of dealing with that in the midst of being on this TV show, and they're all shipped off to a island, an inhabited island, not an uninhabited island, but a small like island with a local population where people sometimes go missing. And I'll say no more than that. Alright, so my next genre isn't necessarily even a genre, it's comic books and graphic novels. I feel like they are a category in and of themselves, even though they can span many genres. And the first of those is Giant Days. I've talked about this a lot when I've had opportunity to talk about comic books because it's one of my favourite series of all time. I have actually completed it, which is rare for me in terms of comic book volumes that span more than like 10 volumes. It's so fantastic. I would happily reread it, and it's about a group of 3 university students, although we do start getting the perspective of a couple of their other friends as well as the series goes on. But it starts off with these 3 university students who are in freshers week at university, so they're just starting out. They are living in halls together, getting to know one another, and we follow them over the course of their undergraduate degrees together. So as they move out of halls, as they look for like student accommodation, and they like do well in their courses, do badly in their courses, they get into relationships, out of relationships, they have fallings out, they get new jobs, everything that you just experience at that age. It was such a relatable series for me. Like, obviously it's a comedy, it's slightly silly, it's slightly exaggerated, but there were certain elements of it, particularly regarding the experience of going to university in the UK that I was just like, I'm taken back there. I'm taken back there, and I loved it. I loved the friendship between the characters. I loved following their journey. It was very nostalgic, very relatable, very, very entertaining and funny. And throughout the series, one of the three friends does go through her own coming out journey. I can't tell if it's better with or without the overhead lights, so I'm going to try it off for a little bit. But then for comic books we have Lumberjanes. So Lumberjanes is really fun. And I would actually class this as sort of like a middle grade comic. Like, it's appropriate for kids and adults. It's a ton of fun and can be enjoyed by all the family, shall we say. It's about a group of kids at a summer camp known as Lumberjanes, which is all about learning wildlife, wilderness skills and enjoying the summer together. But things get a little bit wild. I'm not gonna say that Greek goddesses don't not turn up. Like, some weird stuff happens, and it's just like a fun adventure. It's really entertaining, like really comical, and again a really lovely like demonstration of found family and friendship, and also like coming of age, and also coming of age and figuring out your sexuality in the case of some of the characters. It's stunning. Then lastly, not a comic book but a graphic novel, and one that I'm so excited to say has a film adaptation coming out. Like, I cannot tell you how excited I am for this. That is of course 100 Nights of Hero, which, oh my goodness, the trailer looks amazing. I have loved this graphic novel ever since it first came out. It's by one of my favourite graphic novelists, Isabel Greenberg. Her art, her storylines, her writing, everything is perfection. And this is actually inspired by 1001 Nights, which of course is the story of Shahrazad telling the king a story every night that bleeds into another story in order to stay alive. And this is a take on that, in which our protagonist is telling stories every night to her mistress slash lover in order to stall this man from seducing her. And in that sense, it's a story within a story within a story within a story, and it goes on and on and on like that, and it's so beautiful. Isabel Greenberg's art style is gorgeous. Like, it's so unique. I absolutely love it, but I know I'm gonna love the film too. Like, I'm so excited. Side note, I don't know if you can see, but I'm trying to get into brooches. Like, I'm trying to get into brooches. I feel like they are an accessory that is woefully underrepresented in modern fashion, so this is my brooch. Next up though, we have non-fiction. So talking about relatable, jumping off like the experiences of being a millennial really, the next book on my list is just like such a relatable one. I think if you grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, especially if you were a young woman figuring out your sexuality, and that is Girls Can Kiss Now, which is basically a exploration of the pop culture and just general culture of the 90s and 2000s from the perspective of a queer woman, and kind of like how that related to her sexuality as a lesbian and coming out. And it was just so much fun. I listened to this on audiobook and I just kept thinking, oh my god, I remember that being a conversation in the playground when I was a teenager. I remember like that big drama happening in the celebrity world. I remember when like this celebrity was stigmatized for being bisexual. I was like, oh gosh, yeah, of course that informed me as a young bisexual woman. It was just very relatable. So if you're of a similar age to me, you might find listening to this a very similar experience. Similarly, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal by Jeanette Winterson is another autobiography by an author with particular attention, I think, on her childhood and growing up in a religious family and coming out as a lesbian in the 50s or 60s, I think it was. She also has a famous novel called Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which is semi-autobiographical, so it's interesting when you read those two together and see what was real and what wasn't in the novel, and both are fantastic to be honest. But I just wanted to mention the autobiography here in the non-fiction section. But I do have two honourable mentions for non-fiction which aren't purely sapphic, but you might like to check out, and those are Queer Georgians, which is obviously a history of the Georgian era from a queer perspective, and Queer as Folklore, which again, an exploration of folklore from a queer perspective. Okay, I've turned the light back on. We'll see if that was the correct decision or not. But then I want to talk to you about romance. Of course I have to talk about some romance, although I do think I am woefully underread when it comes to sapphic romance. I could seriously have read a lot more sapphic romance, so please do let me know what your recommendations are. For now, however, I do have a few I want to mention, and the first of those is proper English. This is a historical romance, and it's basically like a sapphic Agatha Christie. It's like Agatha Christie meets sapphic romance. It's a historical romance about a group of friends who've got together in this big old manor house, and secrets start to come out and blackmailers get all up in everybody's business, and you know, the drama unfolds, and our protagonist has to figure out what's going on, and is anybody truly in danger, who's hiding what, who can they trust, who can they not trust, whilst also realising that she's very, very attracted to one of the other women there. and it's a ton of fun. Like, KJ Charles is a very witty writer, and this is a very witty, fun-filled book. Then we have a book that I know some people would not include in a sapphic book recommendation list, but I am going to, and that is Best Hex Ever. The reason why some people might not include this in a list is because it does involve a romantic relationship developing between a man and a woman, but our female protagonist is bisexual. She is therefore sapphic, and I think her sexuality and her coming out journey are a major theme of this novel. So whether you disagree or agree, it's here and it's included, and I absolutely love this. This is like peak cozy romance set in the contemporary world, but following a sort of kitchen witch. She is an expert in magic involving food and tea and brews and cooking, etc. And she owns a little cafe in London where she just sort of like sends the positive energy of her magic into the world through people's biscuits and coffee. And she meets a museum curator that she's very, very attracted to, only to discover that he is also an attendant at the weekend-long wedding getaway of her best friend. And obviously the relationship develops over the course of that wedding, but she's actually reluctant to get involved with somebody because of a hex. A hex that stems from a past relationship and is very much tied in with her kind of struggle with her own sexuality and fear of not being accepted by her family. So that's really, really important throughout the book, and it's just adorable and happy and romantic and lovely and cozy, and about acceptance and figuring yourself out and being happy and confident in yourself, and I love it. It's just lovely. Then last but certainly not least, we have poetry. So I'm going to start things off with a long narrative poem, so a novel in verse, shall we say, called The Song of Us. So this is actually a middle grade novel, although you will very much enjoy this regardless of your age, and it is a retelling of the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and it is stunning. Obviously it is an homage to ancient mythology simply in its structure, because epic verse was the way in which a lot of ancient mythology was shared in antiquity, and that's something that is continued in this novel. And actually just the love of music and art and poetry bleeds into every aspect of it, because we have two very creative music enthusiast slash poetic teens who meet at school when one of them is new to their school and fall in love. But it's difficult because, especially for one of them, her dad's not going to accept the fact that she's interested in other women, and they have to deal with that, and it's about whether they can remain together, but also just like being a teen and being a queer teen and all of the struggles inherent in that. And it's really, really beautiful, really, really stunning, and I actually love the fact that it's in verse. I think it's so well done. Then of course I had to polish off the recommendations in this video with the poetry of Sappho herself. So Sappho is the origin of the term sapphic, and she was an ancient Greek poet from the island of Lesbos who lived during the Archaic period. And though she is not the only ancient Greek woman whose poetry has survived, there are others. Gnosis, don't forget about Gnosis. She is certainly the one with the biggest back catalogue that we can still read today. A lot of her poetry is fragmentary, but even in those fragments you can find such beautiful turns of phrase, such relatable moments in Sappho's life. And a lot of her poetry is love poetry, often about like either past loves or unrequited loves, but there's a lot going on in there, and it is a like beautiful time capsule of historical sapphic love, and it obviously gave us the term sapphic, so we've got to thank her for that. But So those are some of my favourite Sapphic books. There are more. Like, I could have made this video 3 hours long if I wanted to, but this seemed like a reasonable amount for now. Hopefully you got a recommendation that you haven't read before from this list. And if you have any recommendations of your own, please do share them with me. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.